Today, we're cracking open one of the oldest cold cases in the history of science. The defendant, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And we're going to argue that for the last 200 years, he's been wrongfully convicted. You know the name, right? You probably heard it back in high school biology. Lamarck. Oh yeah, the guy with the silly idea about giraffes stretching their necks to make them longer. He's basically become a punchline, the scientist who was famously, spectacularly wrong. But what if that's not the whole story? What if by focusing on the giraffes, we've completely missed the point? Okay, so here it is. Think of this as our official defense brief. The charge against Lamarck is simple. He was wrong. But our defense is that this charge ignores his truly monumental achievement. Lamarck was the very first person to build a complete, systematic theory for the evolution of life that was based entirely on natural laws, with no creator pulling the strings. To really appreciate just how revolutionary this guy was, we have to go back in time. We need to understand the world he was living in, a world where the idea of species changing over time was, well, it was radical, and frankly a little bit dangerous. So back in the late 18th century, you basically had two main schools of thought. On one side, you've got Carl Linnaeus, the great classifier. For him, species were fixed, unchanging, set in stone since creation. Maybe a little bit of mixing and matching, but that's it. On the other side, there was Georges-Louis de Buffon. Officially, he agreed species were fixed. But privately, he was toying with this idea of degeneration, the notion that maybe, just maybe, one species could change into another. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the fear at the time. Buffon cracked open the door to evolution, and then he got spooked and slammed it shut. He saw what it meant. If one species could change into another, then nature was in charge, not God. The entire divinely ordered world as they knew it would just unravel. And this is where Lamarck comes in. He didn't just nudge that door open, he kicked it wide open. He wasn't just hinting that things might change, he was laying out a complete system to explain how it all happened. And this is the core evidence for our defense. So, what did he call this grand process? The Marche de la Nature, the March of Nature. Now, this wasn't some vague mystical idea. For Lamarck, this was a real physical process. It was governed by knowable laws, just like gravity or chemistry. This, right here, was the birth of biology as its own independent science. So how did this march actually work? Well, Lamarck pictured it as this two-part engine. First, there's this internal force, kind of like an escalator, that's always pushing life from simple forms towards more complex ones. Imagine tiny organisms just popping into existence and then hopping on this escalator. But then there's this second force, adapting to the environment. And this is what pushes organisms off the main path, creating all the incredible diversity we see around us. And this brings us to the most famous, or maybe infamous, part of his theory, the idea that characteristics you acquire in your lifetime can be passed on. In his own words, he's describing a water bird. It needs to swim, so it's constantly spreading its toes. That action stretches the skin between them. Over time, that stretched skin becomes webbed feet, and that trait gets passed on to its kids. But here's where everyone gets it wrong. It's so important to get this straight. This was not about birds wanting webbed feet or giraffes wishing for longer necks. Lamarck was a mechanist. He was looking for a physical cause. He proposed that using a body part would draw subtle liquids, think of things like heat or electricity, to that area, causing it to grow and change. It was a theory of physiology, not psychology. All right, no defense case is complete without a tough cross-examination. And for Lamarck, the chief prosecutor was his brilliant, powerful, and, let's be honest, utterly ruthless rival, Georges Cuvier. And believe me, the feeling was mutual. Lamarck did not hold back when it came to Cuvier. He basically called him an arrogant know-it-all, who was more interested in being right than in finding the truth. Their battle wasn't just about fossils. It was personal. But Cuvier's attacks weren't just personal digs. They were based on some really solid scientific arguments. He argued that animal bodies are like these perfectly integrated machines. You can't just change one part without the whole thing falling apart. He pointed to the fossil record and asked, where are all the in-between forms? He even pointed to mummified cats from ancient Egypt that were identical to the cats in Paris. And he, correctly, threw out the idea of spontaneous generation, which was a pretty important starting point for Lamarck's whole system. You have to admit, these were serious, evidence-based challenges. But maybe Cuvier's most devastating blow, the one that's just so simple and intuitive, was this question. How could the habit of flying possibly create wings? You need wings to even begin to fly. It's a classic chicken and egg problem, and it was a knockout punch that stumped evolutionists for decades to come. So, the evidence has been presented. The cross-examination is over. It is time for our closing argument. Yes, Lamarck got the details of the mechanism wrong. We know that now. But was his big picture, his overall vision, the most important leap forward in the history of biology? I mean, just look at the world before him and the world he created. Before Lamarck, if you saw an animal perfectly adapted to its environment, that was proof of a divine plan. Species were created, period. Theology and biology were completely intertwined. Lamarck just swept all of that off the table. He said adaptation is caused by natural physiological laws. Species transform over time. And he took theology and kicked it right out of the lab. And that is why we argue he was the first true biologist. He wasn't content to just collect and describe things, which is what most naturalists did back then. He wanted to explain. He wanted to build a single grand theory for all of life, using only natural causes. He had the incredible courage to build the entire foundation for a new science, a biology totally free from the supernatural. So here's the bottom line. For 2 centuries, we've judged Lamarck on his failed mechanism, on the giraffes. But his real, towering achievement was establishing the very idea of evolution as something science could study. He built the stadium where Darwin would later come and play the winning game. He made the entire game possible. So I'll leave you with this. We know his mechanisms had holes. We know his evidence was thin. But in daring to propose a complete naturalistic system for the entire history of life, in separating science from scripture once and for all, wasn't his vision the true birth of modern biology? I'll let you be the jury on that one.